He didn't walk into a trap. He walked into a wedding, sweet-pressed, heart full, hands shaking, with a ring in his pocket. The world clapped. She smiled, and he said the words every man thinks he means forever. I do. But years later, sitting alone in a quiet apartment, papers on the table, signatures still wet, he realized something no one told him on that day. It wasn't just a promise. It was a contract. And that contract would cost him more than he ever imagined. How the trap is set. The trap doesn't look like a trap at first. It looks like a dream. The family congratulates you. Your parents smile like they've been waiting for this moment all their lives. Friends clap you on the back, call you a good man, say you've finally made it. Even strangers treat you differently, as if wearing a ring instantly makes you more respectable, more complete, more trustworthy. And the truth is, you believe it too, because for years, decades maybe, you've been told that marriage is the prize, the finish line, the ultimate reward for working hard, for being stable, for doing the right things. You've heard it from movies, from family dinners, from the way people look at single men in their 30s and 40s with that unspoken question in their eyes. When are you going to settle down? So when love arrives, when she laughs at your jokes without you having to try too hard, when she holds your hand in public like she's proud to be seen with you, when she leans in and says, she can't imagine life without you, you think, this is it. This is the chapter I've been waiting for, the home I've been building without even knowing it. You feel like every late night at work, every bill paid on time, every lonely weekend was leading you to this moment. And that's the thing about traps. They don't work unless they look safe, unless they look like exactly what you've been searching for. What you don't see is that every romantic gesture you make, every sacrifice you offer without hesitation, every don't worry, I'll take care of it, isn't just deepening the love. It's setting expectations. At first, those expectations feel light, almost invisible. She's grateful. She says, thank you. She notices, but slowly, and so quietly, you don't even realize it. What was once a gift becomes a standard. What was once a surprise becomes a routine. And routines are rarely appreciated. It's not malicious. It's not even intentional. It's just human nature. Once people get used to a certain level of care, they stop seeing it as extra. They start seeing it as normal. And once it's normal, you don't get praised for doing it. You only get noticed when you don't. That's how the first layer of the trap is set. Not with deception, not with cruelty, but with comfort and the quiet belief from both of you that this is how it will always be. But expectations, once set, rarely go away. And one day, you'll wake up and realize you're not just keeping her happy anymore. You're keeping up with a contract neither of you knew you signed. When love turns into obligation, at first, you do it because you want to. You bring her flowers on a Tuesday, not because it's a special day, but because you saw them on the way home and thought of her. You fix the door before she even notices it's broken. You fill her car with gas when you borrow it, and you make sure her favorite coffee is waiting in the kitchen when she wakes up. You don't think of it as a chore. You don't think of it as keeping score. You just do it because you love her, because it feels good to give. And for a while, you think she sees it. You think she appreciates it. You think she knows she has something rare. But here's the quiet shift no one warns you about. Over time, the thank you fades. The little smile when she notices doesn't come as often. What used to feel like a gift now feels like the baseline. You've set a standard, and without realizing it, that standard becomes your new job description. The flowers aren't sweet anymore. They're late. The fixed door isn't impressive. It's what you're supposed to do. The coffee in the kitchen isn't romantic. It's just how mornings are expected to be. This is how love turns into obligation. Not because she's cruel, not because you're unloving, but because human beings adapt to comfort faster than they realize. And once someone adapts, gratitude often gets replaced by assumption. You begin to notice the imbalance. She still wants the attention, the protection, the consistency, but it no longer feels like a two-way exchange. And the cruel part? The moment you pause, the moment you say, I'm tired, or I can't do that right now, you're not met with understanding. You're met with surprise. Or worse, disappointment, because somewhere along the way, your love stopped being a choice. It became an expectation. And expectations don't inspire appreciation. They demand maintenance. You used to feel like you were giving because you loved her. Now you feel like you have to keep giving just to keep the peace. That's when the weight starts to grow. That's when you realize you're no longer showing up out of joy. You're showing up because you're afraid of what happens if you don't. It's a subtle shift, but it's the moment the relationship starts feeling different. It's the moment you realize you're not just loving her anymore. You're working to maintain a role you never officially agreed to play. And if you're not careful, this quiet shift becomes the second layer of the trap. The legal lock. No one talks about this on your wedding day. The music is too loud. The champagne is too sweet. The future is too bright. You're thinking about the honeymoon, about building a home together, about all the firsts you'll share as husband and wife. You're not thinking about the fact that the moment you sign that marriage certificate, you've entered into something far more binding than romance. Marriage isn't just a public declaration of love. It's a legal contract, recognized, enforced, and governed by the state. And like any contract, it comes with terms, obligations, and consequences. But here's the part no one tells you. Those terms don't feel real when things are good. When you're in love, you don't imagine lawyers. You don't picture courtrooms. You don't think about who owns what, or how things would be split if it all fell apart. You think, we'll never be that couple. You think, this is forever. But here's the truth about contracts. They don't exist for when things are going well. They exist for when things break. And when love breaks, the legal side of marriage wakes up. It doesn't care about your wedding vows. It doesn't care about the promises you whispered in the dark. It doesn't care how many times you chose her over yourself. It cares about assets. It cares about accounts. It cares about custody, property, and division. You'll find yourself sitting across from someone you once loved more than anyone in the world, and the conversation won't be about feelings. It will be about numbers, percentages, ownership, and in that moment, you will see marriage for what it is on paper, a merger, a partnership recognized by law, not just by love. This is what I call the legal lock, because once you're in, you can't simply walk away. Breaking it isn't like ending a dating relationship. You can't just hand back a key and wish each other well. You have to untangle finances, divide property, possibly pay support for years after you've stopped sharing a home. And the cruelest part? Even if the split is mutual, even if you both want to be fair, the system still plays by its own rules. Rules that don't favor feelings. Rules that don't care who sacrificed more. Rules that can leave you wondering if the love was worth the cost. It's only when you're staring at those rules in black and white that you understand how tight the lock really is. And by then, you're not just trying to save your heart. You're trying to save the life you've spent decades building. The breaking point. Divorce isn't just paperwork. It's the dismantling of a life. You walk through the house one last time, and suddenly, everything has weight. Not the kind you can measure on a scale, the kind that presses on your chest. This table, you remember the night you sat here until 2 a.m., helping her map out a new business idea. Now, it's an asset to be divided. That couch, you bought it after your first anniversary, thinking it would hold a lifetime of Sunday afternoons. Now, it's on a list with a dollar value beside it. Even the tools in the garage, the ones you've been collecting since your 20s, are now subject to distribution. Nothing feels like yours anymore. Not even the memories, because once the process starts, every part of your shared life becomes something to negotiate, something to fight for, or something to surrender. And the fighting, it changes you. You start saying things you never thought you'd say. You start hearing things from her mouth that make you wonder if the woman in front of you was ever the same person you married. You learn to measure your words, because now everything can be used, not just against you in court, but against the man you believe yourself to be. The breaking point isn't just the day you sign the papers. It's the slow realization, day after day, email after email from your lawyer, that you are no longer partners, you are opposing parties. And here's the part no one wants to admit. It's not always the money that breaks you. It's the loss of the story you thought you were writing. You thought this was the home you'd grow old in, the love you'd still be holding decades later. the place you could always return to when the world felt heavy. Now, it's a battlefield, one where winning doesn't feel like winning, because even if you keep the house, it doesn't feel like home anymore. And maybe that's the final cruelty of the marriage trap. It convinces you, at the start, that you found the safest place in the world, but at the end, you realize it's where you lost the most. The emotional debt, the financial cost, you can see on paper. Bank statements, settlement agreements, numbers that can be calculated down to the last cent. But the emotional cost, there's no ledger for that. And yet, it's the one you'll carry the longest. You think you're just splitting assets, but you're also splitting yourself. Years of putting her needs above yours. Birthdays you didn't celebrate because you were too busy working overtime to pay for her dream vacation. Opportunities you passed up because she didn't want to move. Hobbies you let die quietly in the corner of your mind. Because we didn't have time for them anymore. You start to realize you weren't just building a marriage. You were slowly dismantling pieces of yourself to keep the structure standing. And here's the cruelest part. When the papers are signed, she walks away with half of what you built together. But she also walks away with years of the best version of you, the man who gave and gave and gave. What's left behind is a man who now has to figure out who he is. Without the roles he's been playing for decades, you'll grieve things you didn't even know you lost. The man you were when you still believed in forever. The feeling of walking through your front door and knowing you were coming home to someone. The trust you thought was unshakable. The simple belief that love was enough. This grief, it doesn't show up in court. It doesn't get mentioned in legal filings. But it shows up at 2 a.m. when the house is too quiet and you find yourself scrolling through old photos, just to remember what it felt like to be wanted. It shows up in the way you hesitate before getting close to someone new. Not because you can't love again, but because you know the cost now. And once you've paid it in full, you think twice before signing up for another bill. They call it emotional baggage. But that's not what it is. It's emotional debt, and debt takes time to pay off. The balance doesn't drop the moment you meet someone else. It doesn't clear just because you're moving on. It clears slowly, day by day, as you rebuild the parts of yourself you gave away without realizing you'd never get them back. And until you do, you'll guard what's left like a man who's learned sometimes the most expensive thing you can give isn't your money, it's your heart. Why so many men regret it? Divisting to the bifruit of Rumes, it's not that they regret loving her. Most men, if they're honest, will tell you there were moments in that marriage they wouldn't trade for anything. It's not that they regret the years they spent. Those years shaped them. They taught lessons no book, no video, no mentor could ever teach. No, what they regret is saying "I do" without knowing what they were really agreeing to. They thought they were promising to love one woman, through better or worse, in sickness and in health, for as long as they both shall live. But they didn't realize they were also agreeing to share everything they'd built, everything they'd yet to build, and to do so under rules they didn't write. Rules that don't bend for good intentions. Rules that don't care who gave more, who sacrificed more, who tried harder. They regret not asking the hard questions before the wedding, not understanding how the system would treat their life's work if the marriage ended. They regret assuming love and law were the same thing. They're not. Love is emotional. Law is transactional. One speaks to the heart. The other speaks to the contract. And here's the bitter truth. When you stand at the altar, you're not just making a promise to each other. You're making a legal commitment the state will enforce. Most men don't see the trap until it's closing, until they're in a courtroom, being spoken about in third person by lawyers who weren't there when they fell in love, but are now deciding how their life will be divided. They regret the naivety, thinking forever was enough to protect them. They regret assuming that being a good man, a faithful husband, a devoted provider, would guarantee loyalty in return. And maybe the deepest regret of all is realizing too late that marriage changes people. Sometimes it changes her. Sometimes it changes you. Sometimes it changes both. And by the time you notice, you've already built a life together that's too intertwined to separate without tearing pieces of yourself away. That's the part no one says out loud. Not in wedding speeches. Not in family dinners. Not when they ask, So when are you going to settle down? They don't tell you that settling down can also mean settling for less of yourself. And when a man finally sees that truth, when he looks at what he's lost, what it's cost him, and how blind he was to the real terms of the deal, that's when regret sets in. Not because he didn't love, but because he didn't understand what he was signing up for until it was far too late. The hard lesson. The lesson isn't never get married. That's the mistake bitter men make, turning their pain into a warning label that doesn't fit everyone. The real lesson is to know exactly what you're agreeing to before you say, I do. Because marriage is two things at once, and most men only see one. It's a vow, and it's a contract. It's a moment of love, and a binding legal agreement. One speaks to the heart, the other speaks to the system. You can't afford to forget either one. If you only see the vow, you'll miss the fine print. If you only see the contract, you'll miss the joy that love can bring. But if you walk in blind, you risk paying with more than you ever intended to give. Here's what I would tell my younger self, and any man willing to listen. First, know the law. Not just the romantic part, not just the church ceremony, but the legal framework you're stepping into. Understand how property is divided where you live. Understand what marital assets really mean. Understand what could happen to your income, your savings, your retirement, if the marriage ends. Second, know her values before you know her favorite songs. It's easy to fall for charm, for beauty, for chemistry, but charm fades. Chemistry cools. Values, or the lack of them, will shape every choice you make together. Third, protect yourself without shame. A prenup doesn't mean you expect divorce. It means you understand life is unpredictable, and you're willing to have an honest conversation before emotions get in the way. Good men protect their families, but wise men also protect themselves. Fourth, keep parts of yourself alive outside the marriage. Your friendships, your hobbies, your independence. If you give all of yourself to the marriage and it fails, you'll be left with nothing to stand on. Because here's the truth. Love can survive honesty, but it rarely survives blind assumption. Walking into marriage with your eyes open doesn't make you cold. It doesn't make you unromantic. It makes you prepared. And a prepared man is far harder to trap. The hard lesson is this. It's not enough to love deeply. You must also protect wisely, because forever is a beautiful word, but in this world, it's only as strong as the foundation you build beneath it. Love is real. It's worth experiencing. It can change a man's life in ways he never thought possible, but marriage on paper is a deal. And like any deal, you have to know the terms before you sign, because the trap isn't marriage itself. The trap is believing it's only about love, believing the wedding day is the end of the story, instead of the beginning of a contract. No one stands at the altar thinking about courtrooms. No one says, I do, while picturing property appraisals, bank account statements, or custody agreements. You're thinking about the way she looks in that dress, the way her hand fits in yours, the life you can't wait to start. And that's beautiful, until the day the beauty fades, and you find yourself staring at a set of rules that don't care how in love you once were. The trap you can avoid isn't avoiding love. It's avoiding blindness. Go in with your eyes open. Talk about the uncomfortable things before you're forced to. Understand the system you're stepping into. Protect yourself not because you expect the worst, but because you respect yourself enough to prepare for it. And remember this, a man who knows the rules is far harder to trap. You can still have the love. You can still build the life. You can still say, I do, but you'll say it knowing exactly what you're agreeing to. That's the difference between a man who gets caught in the marriage trap and a man who walks into marriage with strength, clarity, and choice. Because forever isn't built on blind hope. It's built on truth and the courage to face it before it's too late. So if you're standing where I once stood, with the ring in your pocket, your heart in your throat, and a future in front of you that feels like a dream, stop, take a breath, ask yourself the hard questions now, because love will always ask for your heart. Marriage will ask for far more, and the only way to avoid the trap is to make sure you know exactly what it's worth.